I stepped into the church, and the weight of every stare pressed down on me. Vanessa's smirk hit like ice. I was the disgrace Dad had kicked out years ago. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the memory of every whispered insult and slammed door that had haunted me. And then the lawyer cleared his throat, calling my name. The entire room froze. I saw the disbelief flicker across faces I once trusted. Do you feel that tension too? That moment where the past and present collide, leaving everyone wondering what comes next. I did, and I was ready. I hesitated at the entrance, my shoes catching on the patterned carpet, and I felt every eye in the church lock onto me. Some stared with curiosity, others with judgment, and a few, I was certain, with silent disdain. Vanessa's smirk hit me first. She leaned slightly to one of our cousins and whispered something, her lips curling in that familiar sneer that had haunted my childhood. I could almost hear the echo of her words. Look at her, the disgrace Dad kicked out. Every syllable, every tone, carried years of resentment that had been festering quietly, like a wound that never fully healed. I drew in a shaky breath and tried to steady myself, reminding my heart that I had fought too hard, survived too much to crumble now. Yet as I stepped further inside, memories clawed at the edges of my mind. The slammed doors of my father's study, the cold, distant eyes of relatives at holiday dinners, the whispered laughter behind my back. I could feel them now, pressing against my chest. It was a familiar ache, but today, the weight was heavier because it wasn't just the past. This was the moment when everyone who had once judged me would witness who I had become, or so I hoped. Vanessa's eyes met mine briefly, sharp and calculating. There was no warmth, no recognition of the years I had spent clawing my way back from the shadows of her contempt. Just that predatory gaze that reminded me of every time she had taken pleasure in my embarrassment, every time she had thrown a verbal dagger with the precision of someone trained in cruelty. My pulse quickened. I could feel the tiny tremors of fear and anticipation mingle in my chest. Something was about to happen, something that would tip the balance, but I didn't yet know what. I found a quiet spot near the back of the church, a place where the light from the stained glass windows barely touched the polished wood floors. The music was soft, almost mournful, but it did little to quiet the storm inside me. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, and my mind transported me back to the day Dad had shut the door on me forever. I remembered the words, sharp and cold. "You're a disgrace. I can't have you here anymore." I had been 19, naive and desperate for approval I would never receive. I had left that home with nothing but a suitcase and a determination not to break. Yet here I was, decades later, standing in the place that should have been filled with sorrow, but instead felt like a battlefield. I wasn't sure if the others understood what a battle it had been to even arrive here without breaking down. Some would see my calm demeanor and assume I had moved on, but they didn't know the nights I had spent replaying every insult, every slight, over and over, until I had trained myself to smile through it, to speak without shaking, to breathe without faltering. The organ hummed beneath the somber words of the officiant, but I barely heard them. My mind was caught in a delicate dance between past and present, memory and expectation. I felt the eyes of distant relatives on me, measuring, judging, perhaps expecting me to falter. I could almost hear their thoughts, murmuring silently, questioning whether I had truly changed, whether the disgrace had returned to its place. I held my posture, letting the calm exterior mask the storm beneath. There was power in silence, a kind of quiet defiance that spoke louder than any shout. I noticed a few faces soften, strangers perhaps, who might have pitied me or admired my resilience. That small acknowledgement was a balm, yet it was fleeting. My focus kept snapping back to Vanessa, her presence like a shadow in the corner of my vision. She leaned against the pew, arms crossed, chin tilted, and watched me like a predator observing prey. I could sense the anticipation in her body, the thrill of the moment, like she expected me to crumble under her gaze. But I didn't. I wouldn't. Not today. In that brief pause, I allowed myself a moment to breathe and to remember who I was beyond the weight of family judgment. I remembered the years I had spent building a life from fragments, the nights of tears that had carved empathy into my soul, the quiet victories that no one had celebrated. These memories were my armor, not arrogance, but a protective shell that allowed me to step forward without the need to prove my worth to anyone but myself. And yet, even with all of that preparation, there was that lingering uncertainty, that tiny flicker of something unspoken in the air. Something was coming, a shift I could not yet define, but I sensed it with every nerve ending in my body. I could feel the tension crackling, unseen but palpable, stretching between the pews, hovering over the polished floor, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, poised to hit when the moment was right. My stomach twisted, my pulse quickened, and a strange thrill mingled with my fear. I shifted slightly, letting my gaze fall on a small bouquet near the altar. A fleeting reminder that even in spaces filled with grief, there could be moments of reflection, of clarity. For a heartbeat, I let myself sink into that feeling, to rest from the constant battle of judgment, to breathe without the pressure of proving myself to Vanessa, to Dad, to the ghosts of the past. And then I straightened, bracing for what was about to unfold, aware that nothing would ever be the same once the next moment arrived. The church felt larger now, the whispers louder, and the anticipation thick as fog. I could sense the subtle shift in the air as eyes turned toward the front, waiting for the next act in a story I thought I had no part in controlling. But I did, and I was ready, even if I didn't yet know the form it would take. Something was coming, and when it did, everything would change. The murmurs of the crowd dimmed to a tense silence as the lawyer stepped forward. Every eye seemed to focus on him, but I could feel the weight of Vanessa's gaze like a blade pressing into my shoulder. My heart thudded, not with fear, but with that strange mixture of anticipation and dread that comes just before a life-altering moment. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and called my name. Claire Bennett. The sound of my name in that solemn voice was sharper than any insult I had endured before. The church seemed to hold its breath. I could see the flicker of recognition in some faces, the shock in others, and Vanessa's smirk faltered, just slightly, like a mask cracking under unseen pressure. My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression calm. I had learned long ago how to wear control like a second skin. I felt my mind racing, considering every possible reason for this public summoning. Was it merely a formality? A perfunctory mention of a small inheritance? Or was it something far more consequential, something that would tilt the balance of power I had always assumed she held in this family. The tension was electric, a charged wire running through the pews, threading through the air to everyone watching. Could you feel it too? That instant when the past and present hover in the same space, and you realize everything is about to pivot? I did. The lawyer's gaze swept the room briefly, landing back on me. "Claire, you are listed as a beneficiary in your father's estate," he said, and the words landed like stones dropped into still water. The ripple was immediate. Some gasps, a few whispered questions, and then the stunned silence that follows when expectations are utterly shattered. Vanessa's face went pale, her perfect composure crumbling for the briefest instant. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, the sharp intake of breath, as her mind raced to reconcile what she thought she knew with this new reality. I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to brush my lips, not smugness, but a quiet acknowledgement of the irony. I thought, you thought I was powerless. You thought I was gone. And yet here I stand in the center of your gaze, holding what you never expected me to hold. My internal voice spoke to you, the reader. Notice the irony, the tension, the way the world can twist beneath our feet without warning. Can you feel it too? The lawyer continued, outlining the details. A property in the city, a modest but significant sum from an investment fund, and certain sentimental items of value to the family, all designated for me. I could hear the mental calculations running through Vanessa's mind. How did she get this? Why wasn't I told? Dad would have never. Her panic was almost tangible, and I held my breath for the flicker of her next move. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't gloating. I simply observed, letting the unfolding drama play out in the faces around me. There was satisfaction in calm, a power far more potent than any display of anger or revenge. My mind flicked back to every night spent piecing my life together, the jobs, the apartments, the quiet victories no one ever noticed. This was the culmination of years of resilience, not just the stroke of luck from a lawyer's reading. Yet the room had not fully absorbed the shock. Eyes darted between me and Vanessa, murmurs rising and falling in hesitant waves. Some of the distant relatives, the ones who had always treated me kindly yet cautiously, began to smile faintly, their sympathy mixing with surprise. I could almost hear the silent question passing through their minds. Has she changed? Has she always had this strength, quietly growing in the shadows? Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tight. The micro-expressions betrayed her calculation. She was trying to regain control, to assess how much damage this revelation could do to her carefully maintained position. I felt the urge to speak, to shatter the fragile order she clung to, but I resisted. The moment was not mine to force. It belonged to the unfolding shock, to the silent electricity that filled the room. My gaze drifted to the small bouquet near the front, the one I had noticed in the previous chapter. It seemed trivial, yet grounding. In that moment, I allowed myself to reflect, to breathe, to acknowledge the depth of what this revelation meant, not just for Vanessa or the family, but for me. I had endured, I had returned, and now the world, or at least this room, had to reckon with that truth. The lawyer concluded his reading, stepping back as murmurs rose into whispered conversations. I could feel the tension shift slightly, the way the air seemed to hum with unspoken questions. I met Vanessa's eyes, holding them just long enough to convey a message without a single word. I am still here, and I am not what you expected. That tiny moment of silent confrontation was more potent than any argument, any declaration of power. I sensed that the story was far from over. This revelation was only the first layer, the opening move in a game that would unfold over the hours, days, perhaps even years to come. The room's attention would remain divided, the family dynamics forever altered, and I would navigate it not with force, but with precision and quiet awareness. Did you feel that shift too? The way the power of information can ripple through a room, turning assumptions upside down? As the lawyer stepped aside, I allowed myself a subtle exhale. I had navigated the first storm, witnessed the first tremor of upheaval, and observed the first cracks in Vanessa's carefully maintained armor. The moment was fleeting, yet electric, and I could feel the promise of what was to come, waiting just beyond the edges of perception. My pulse settled slightly, though the anticipation lingered, prickling along my spine, reminding me that the most consequential moments were yet to arrive. I moved toward the back pew, letting the weight of the revelation from the lawyer settle over me. The air still buzzed with hushed whispers and stolen glances, but my mind had already begun its own quiet investigation. Every memory I had carefully tucked away over the years rose to the surface. I remembered birthdays when my existence was nearly invisible, when Vanessa's accomplishments were praised endlessly, and I was simply a shadow. Every insult, every slight, every moment I had been dismissed began to converge in a pattern I had never fully noticed before. It was in that moment that I noticed the old ledger Dad had kept, the one I had glimpsed years ago but never had the chance to study closely. I remembered how he had always taken meticulous notes, leaving scraps of insight hidden in his careful records. A memory flickered, a folder with the words "Family Holdings" scrawled in Dad's familiar handwriting. At the time, I had assumed it was irrelevant to me, irrelevant to Vanessa even, but now the pieces began to connect. There were mentions of property titles, investment trusts, even the allocation of authority in the company Dad had run. Something had been deliberately withheld. Some element of control kept out of Vanessa's reach. Something only I, with the careful attention I had always paid, could now piece together. I allowed myself a moment to consider the irony. All those years I had been pushed away, written off as the family shame, yet it seemed that in the shadows, Dad had prepared a path for me that no one, not even Vanessa, was aware of. My pulse quickened at the thought. Could it be that the balance of power, carefully assumed by Vanessa over the years, was not as fixed as she believed? The thought both thrilled and unnerved me. The plot twist revealed not just potential wealth, but a subtle, invisible leverage over a family that had spent decades undermining me. I let my eyes wander over the congregation. Some faces were stiff with polite sympathy. Others seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for me to react in some way that would confirm the narrative they had always believed, that Claire Bennett, the disgrace, would crumble, overwhelmed by the weight of family expectations. But I didn't crumble, not now, not ever again. Instead, I allowed the memories to wash over me, acknowledging the sting without letting it dictate my actions. I wanted the audience, if you are following me, to understand that resilience is not the absence of pain, but the mastery of it, the ability to let the storm shape you rather than destroy you. As I stood there quietly, I allowed myself to interact, Silently, with those watching through my perspective, I imagined your voice in my head, asking, how does it feel to realize that the family who wronged you has inadvertently set the stage for your comeback? It is a curious sensation, a bitter sweetness, mingled with cautious anticipation. The weight of betrayal remains, but now it shares space with a quiet sense of empowerment. And yes, that empowerment is cautious. I do not yet know how the next moves will play out, but I can feel their possibilities like threads waiting to be woven. The church's light shifted as clouds moved across the sky, casting patterns across the pews. I let my gaze drift toward Vanessa. Her face was a mask of composure, but I could sense the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted her dress. She had noticed the same hints I had, the ledger, the meticulous patterns in Dad's estate, the hints that everything was not as she had assumed. That small tremor told me she was calculating, revising the narrative she had always relied on. And that realization sent a thrill of anticipation racing through me. She thought she controlled the story. She didn't yet know who held the pen. I remembered long afternoons in my father's study, the smell of old paper and ink, the hushed conversations I had overheard but dismissed. Those fragments now carried weight. Every offhand remark, every comment hidden in casual conversation now seemed like pieces of a puzzle that Dad had left behind, perhaps knowing that I would one day need to discover them. And as I pieced them together, the room around me faded slightly, leaving only the logic of patterns and the quiet pulse of potential advantage. Yet even amid this quiet realization, the emotional toll remained. Memories of rejection, isolation, and ridicule threatened to surge forward, but I gently anchored myself, breathing, centering, and allowing a small measure of vulnerability to surface. I shared, if only in thought with you, the reader, the understanding that surviving family betrayal is not merely about clever strategy. It is about surviving the quiet, insidious pain that leaves traces long after the insults have ended. I could feel the tension in the room building again, a subtle current of expectation as Vanessa's eyes met mine fleetingly. She did not speak, yet the message was clear. She was wary, assessing, trying to gauge my reaction. And I allowed myself the faintest smile, an acknowledgement not of triumph, but of recognition. The chessboard was set, the pieces aligned, and the first true move of the game was mine to consider. I let the silence stretch a moment longer, giving the congregation time to absorb the revelation of the lawyer's earlier announcement, but also the sense that I was quietly taking in all that had been hidden. Every glance, every gesture, every whisper held potential meaning. I could feel my pulse steady, the emotional roller coaster easing for a moment as the weight of comprehension settled. I allowed myself to pause, to breathe, to appreciate the complexity of the moment. And as I did, I felt the micro cliffhanger, the subtle awareness that this was only the beginning. The patterns Dad had left, the hints of withheld power, the subtle cracks in Vanessa's perceived authority, all of it pointed toward future moves, future confrontations, and future revelations. The church felt suspended in time, every breath, every glance, every shadow a prelude to the next unfolding chapter. I stood there, poised between memory and anticipation, and felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from recognizing that knowledge is the first step toward reclaiming the narrative that was always mine to shape. The lawyer's voice cut through the quiet murmur, deliberate and measured, drawing every eye to him once again. "There is one more matter," he said, and a subtle tension rippled through the room. Even the air seemed heavier, as if anticipating the weight of his next words. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the thrill of anticipation. I knew this was the moment that could truly tip the scales in a way Vanessa had never imagined. He paused, glancing briefly at Vanessa before continuing. "It appears that certain family assets, previously thought to be allocated entirely to Vanessa, were in fact intended to remain under discretionary oversight, to be administered as your father saw fit. And Claire, you are now the named executor of this discretion." The words landed like a hammer, silent but unmistakable. Vanessa's eyes widened, a subtle falter in her composed exterior. She thought she had secured her position, thought she was untouchable, but the revelation hit like an unexpected storm. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but a delicate awareness of power, shifting subtly in my favor. The room seemed to tilt slightly under the weight of this disclosure. Whispers spread quickly among the family, their disbelief almost audible. I observed Vanessa closely. She adjusted her posture, a quick, sharp movement, betraying the calculations racing through her mind. She had assumed I was naive, uninformed, perhaps even broken by years of marginalization. How little she had understood. I reminded myself to remain calm, to avoid letting the thrill of the twist dictate my behavior. This was a test of patience as much as perception. I could feel your presence, the reader, sensing the anticipation too, wondering how Vanessa would react, how I would navigate the subtle power shifting beneath the polished wood of the pews. Could you feel it? The quiet tension, the almost imperceptible tremor of a family's dynamics being rewritten without a single raised voice? I allowed my gaze to sweep the room, noting the silent acknowledgement in some faces, the incredulous looks on others. Those who had doubted me, who had quietly judged or pitied me over the years, now caught a glimpse of a reality they hadn't foreseen. I felt the micro cliffhanger growing in the air, that moment where everyone waits to see what I would do next. Would I assert myself aggressively? Would I confront Vanessa openly? No, that was never my style. My strategy relied on precision, subtlety, and emotional intelligence. Vanessa's eyes flickered toward me, searching for a hint of my next move, a sign that I might react with anger or retaliation. But I only met her gaze with measured calm. My internal monologue reached out to you, the reader. Notice the difference. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and those who are used to the sound of control fail to hear the quiet authority in patience and calculation. I began to envision my next steps. I would need to navigate this revelation with care, leveraging the subtle power shift without creating unnecessary friction. It was not enough for Vanessa to lose her assumed control. I needed her to be unaware of the full scope of my awareness, to leave her guessing, to keep the audience in suspense, wondering what my true intentions were. Could you feel that anticipation rising? The way the tension threads through the room, connecting us all to the unfolding narrative. I reflected on the years of preparation that had led me here, the quiet study of family patterns, the careful observation of behaviors, the internal rehearsals of countless scenarios where power shifted in silence. I had endured insults, exclusions, and emotional manipulation, all of which had refined my understanding of strategy and timing. The revelations of today were merely catalysts. The real influence came from understanding how to wield it without surrendering to visible confrontation. Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat, unaware that I had noticed her subtle adjustment of her ring, her fingers brushing against a document she hoped no one would see. It was a detail she believed I had missed, a micro-expression she assumed would escape observation. But I had seen it. Every detail mattered. Every unspoken action carried meaning. I allowed myself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, letting her uncertainty grow without uttering a single word. The micro cliffhanger was now hers, the question of how she would respond, and I relished the delicate balance of suspense. I let the room settle briefly, giving space for the tension to breathe, for whispers to rise and fall like waves. The subtle, almost imperceptible anticipation hung in the air like an electric charge, and I could feel the audience, both the family and the unseen reader, leaning in. Every thought, every hesitation, every micro-expression became part of a carefully orchestrated dance. And in that quiet, I positioned myself at the center, not with aggression, but with awareness, patience, and a keen sense of timing. The lawyer concluded his announcement, stepping back, but the effect remained. Vanessa's posture was slightly more rigid, her attention split between observing me and calculating next steps. I felt the weight of the family's gaze, the potential power now subtly in my hands, and I allowed myself a brief internal acknowledgement. The shift was underway, not through force, but through understanding, strategy, and emotional precision. And as the tension lingered, I knew the next moment would be pivotal. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Vanessa's move. And in that pause, I could almost hear your thoughts. What will she do? How will Claire handle it? That is the beauty of this moment. Every eye on us, every mind racing, every secret laid bare without a single shout, a single confrontation. This is subtle power, quiet influence, and the first true move in a game that would test patience, cunning, and resilience. I finally approached Vanessa after what felt like hours suspended in quiet tension. The murmurs around us faded into the background, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat. Her eyes met mine, sharp and calculating, brimming with disbelief and fury. "Claire," she said, voice tight, almost trembling. I could sense the storm behind her carefully maintained composure. This was the moment we had both been preparing for in our own ways, though she hadn't realized I had anticipated it long before she did. I took a steady breath, ensuring my words carried neither malice nor triumph. "Vanessa," I began, keeping my tone calm. "There's more to what you think you know. Dad may have made decisions you didn't expect, but it wasn't because he favored you over me. It was because he trusted me to understand the responsibility he left behind." Her jaw tightened, her fingers clenching against the pew. But I didn't let her reaction dictate my next words. Every syllable was measured, precise, carrying the truth without cruelty, acknowledging the past while framing a new reality. Her face flushed, a mixture of anger and shock, and I could almost hear the thoughts racing through her mind. How did she know? How could she have pieced this together? I had anticipated this mental storm. My power wasn't in forcing her to submit, but in letting her confront her own uncertainty, letting her realize the balance she assumed was never fully hers to command. The room felt smaller, every glance between us magnified. the family watching as the silent chessboard played out. I allowed a brief pause, a breath heavy with unspoken history. I know the years haven't been easy, I continued softly, for either of us. But the truth is here, and it's not about winning or losing. It's about understanding what's been hidden and deciding how we move forward. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but found herself momentarily at a loss. I could see the weight of realization pressing on her, the way the years of rivalry, misunderstanding, and hidden resentment were unraveling in the light of facts she could no longer ignore. I let myself briefly sink into memory, recalling the long afternoons we had spent as children, the fleeting moments of laughter that had existed between us despite the constant tension. I remembered her stubborn stubbornness, my attempts to reach out, and the small gestures of connection that had always been overshadowed by parental favoritism. Sharing these memories, even silently with you, the reader, allows the full spectrum of emotion to surface. The pain, the longing, the fleeting moments of joy that remind us we are human, capable of both hurt and love. Her reaction was immediate. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, then softened slightly, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her defenses. I didn't seize it with glee. Instead, I met it with patience, letting the truth of our shared history resonate without exploitation. I wanted the audience, yourself included, to feel the oscillation between shock and empathy, the emotional rise and fall that mirrors the turbulence of reconciliation and revelation. Could you sense the subtle rhythm of tension and release? That push and pull, the roller coaster that keeps the heart engaged. Vanessa's voice was finally steady but quiet, almost fragile. I didn't know, I never realized. Her admission was unpolished, tinged with guilt and disbelief. I acknowledged it silently, allowing the room to absorb not just her words, but the significance behind them. The shift wasn't about punishing her. It was about illuminating truths that had been buried beneath assumptions, control, and familial hierarchies. My control lay not in dominance, but in clarity, in the subtle assertion of reality over perception. The family watched, some leaning forward in curiosity, others recoiling slightly at the intensity of the exchange. I could feel the collective emotional pulse, the way it mirrored the story unfolding in my own mind. Every eye, every breath, every subtle shift of posture contributed to the narrative's tension. The reader's emotions, if you are following closely, rise and fall in tandem. First shock at the revelation, then sympathy for the vulnerabilities exposed, and finally satisfaction at the dignity maintained throughout confrontation. I allowed the moment to stretch, creating space for reflection. I let Vanessa see me not as an adversary, but as a person shaped by pain, resilience, and careful observation. I wanted her to understand that the years of judgment and exclusion were not the sum total of my existence. They were the crucible that had forged a deeper awareness, a strategic patience that did not require cruelty to assert itself. The micro cliffhanger hung in the air. Would she respond with continued resistance, or would she absorb the truth quietly? In that pause, I revisited a fleeting memory. A younger Vanessa helping me up after a stumble on a cold winter morning. The rare moments of shared laughter, the brief camaraderie that had existed despite tension. These memories reminded me, and quietly, you, the reader, that even in the most toxic environments, moments of connection can linger, shaping our responses, tempering our actions and infusing our strategies with empathy. Vanessa's reaction was slow, deliberate. She exhaled a soft but audible release of tension and looked away briefly. I met her gaze again, steady but compassionate. I did not triumph openly. I merely allowed the truth to settle, to stand as its own authority. And in that quiet, I felt the subtle shift. The balance of understanding had begun to tip, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity, empathy, and measured presence. As the room absorbed the layers of tension and revelation, I allowed myself a subtle acknowledgement of what had been achieved. The confrontation had not destroyed, it had illuminated. The roller coaster of emotion ebbed and flowed, leaving both clarity and empathy in its wake. And as I stepped back, I sensed the quiet anticipation of what was yet to come, the micro cliffhanger of unresolved power and hidden strategies waiting in the wings. The church felt heavy with silence after the confrontation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Vanessa sat in the pew, her shoulders slumped, her face pale and tight, with the realization that her carefully constructed world had shifted beneath her. I could see the confusion and frustration mingling with shame in her eyes, the internal reckoning of a lifetime of assumptions suddenly undone. Around us, the other family members exchanged glances, some leaning forward in astonishment, others whispering to themselves in disbelief. They had expected drama, confrontation, perhaps even a spectacle, but what unfolded was quieter, more profound, and far more unsettling. I stood in the back of the church for a moment, absorbing the ripple effect of the events. I allowed myself to notice the subtle shifts in expression, the faint tremors of emotion that passed through the room. No one spoke yet, but the weight of realization pressed down on all of us. This was the aftermath of truth laid bare, an unspoken reckoning, a silent acknowledgement that the past could not simply be ignored. I felt a strange sense of calm, tempered by empathy. The upheaval had consequences, but I did not relish them. I simply observed, understanding that the consequences were a natural result of what had come before. I could feel your presence, the reader, following me through this tense pause. Can you sense the strange mix of satisfaction and discomfort that comes with watching justice unfold quietly, without malice, but with clarity? The emotional pendulum had swung fully, and now it lingered in a moment of reflection, giving space for both empathy and realization. The micro cliffhanger had passed, yet its resonance remained. Everyone was forced to consider the truth, to reflect on their own positions and assumptions. Vanessa looked up finally, her eyes meeting mine for a brief instant. The anger was gone, replaced with something more complex, a mixture of regret, understanding, and cautious acknowledgement. I did not gloat. I simply nodded slightly, a subtle recognition of her humanity and the shared history that had shaped both of us. I had long learned that victory was not measured by humiliation inflicted on others, but by the quiet assertion of integrity and awareness. In this, I felt the full weight of catharsis, both for myself and perhaps for those around me. I remembered once more the years of exclusion, the whispered words, the closed doors, and the quiet resilience that had carried me through. Those memories, once sources of pain, now acted as anchors. They reminded me that the journey from rejection to recognition is never straightforward, that recovery and empowerment require both intelligence and patience. I could feel you with me, the reader, sharing in these reflections, feeling the ebb and flow of tension, pain, and satisfaction that had carried us here. The room slowly began to stir. Some family members averted their eyes, caught between surprise and discomfort, while others seemed to study me with a new sense of respect, perhaps even admiration. I allowed these reactions to wash over me without clinging to them. They were incidental to the true resolution. The quiet power of understanding, of reclaiming narrative without aggression, of asserting one's presence through clarity and composure rather than spectacle. I took a small step forward, glancing at the empty space where Dad's casket had rested. The weight of his absence was undeniable, yet I no longer felt trapped by it. His decisions, the patterns he had left behind, and even his errors had all contributed to the tools I now wielded, not weapons, but instruments of awareness and agency. I felt the full scope of my own growth, the delicate interplay of strategy and empathy that allowed me to navigate the complex web of family dynamics without losing myself in anger or resentment. Vanessa remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I did not approach her further, knowing that the final confrontation was complete. The truth had been delivered, the balance had shifted, and the responsibility now rested in the understanding of each individual. The emotional roller coaster had reached its final dip, and yet the residue of tension lingered in the form of awareness and reflection. I could sense, as you likely do, the satisfaction that comes not from vengeance, but from the assertion of selfhood and the recognition of boundaries long denied. As I made my way to the exit, I felt the subtle, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the congregation around me. Heads turned, whispers softened, and the tension eased into a quiet acknowledgement of change. My pace was deliberate, unhurried, yet imbued with a sense of purpose. I did not glance back to savor victory, nor did I hurry to escape the scene. Instead, I moved with the calm assurance of someone who had navigated turmoil, endured injustice, and emerged with clarity intact. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the polished floor. I felt the warmth on my face, a gentle reminder that life moves forward, and that the past, while formative, does not dictate the entirety of what is to come. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of flowers and candle smoke mingle in my senses, grounding me in the present. This was the moment of rebirth, of strategic and emotional reclamation, the culmination of patience, observation, and quiet resilience. And as I stepped out of the church into the open air, I allowed a subtle interaction with you, the reader. Can you feel the weight of the journey we have shared? The slow rise from despair to awareness, from isolation to quiet influence, from rejection to recognition. Every step I take now carries the imprint of those trials, but also the certainty that I move forward with intelligence, empathy, and purpose. Each individual left behind will face the truth in their own way, and I walk forward with dignity intact. The wind lifted gently, brushing against my hair, and I knew that the story was complete in one sense, yet ongoing in another. Every person, every family, must confront the truths they have long avoided. The game of perception and influence continues, but I have reclaimed my place in it, not with force, but with understanding, insight, and emotional strength. And in that quiet, powerful assertion, I felt the full resonance of closure, catharsis, and rebirth, leaving the church and the past behind while carrying forward the lessons that would guide every future step.